Hi, good evening. I'm Laurie Tisch, and it's really such a great pleasure to welcome all of you to another Aspen Institute event at Roosevelt House. I think most of you know that this Public Policy Institute at Hunter College is the historic home of Sarah and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Jennifer tells a story much better than I do about how the three of them lived here together. So you'll have to come back and hear that story from President Raab. It's quite interesting. And I would also like to thank President Raab. I don't see her here, but she have been incredible in running this, hosting this program for the past 4 years. And of course, always thanks to Elliot Gerson and the Aspen Institute. I've often said when my brothers and I started this program, just about 4 years ago, we were thinking of a way to honor my father who had recently passed away. And we thought that having conversations with great leaders, like you'll hear tonight, would be the way. But it is really everything we dreamed of and so much more. So thank you, Elliot, and the Aspen Institute, and my staff at the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund for making this program truly a dream come true. So as I said, tonight's program is part of the series Conversations with Great Leaders in honor of Preston Robert Tisch. And many of you have been here before, and you know we've had extraordinary leaders. We've had Mayor Cory Booker and Wynton Marsalis, Billie Jean King, Danny Meyer. Our last event was retired U.S. Army General Stanley McChrystal. And I think tonight we're in for such a great treat. We've had, as I said, we've had incredible leaders. Tonight is no exception. My friend Wes Moore, I'm proud to call my friend, is a man of many, many interests and talents. A youth advocate, Army combat veteran, social entrepreneur, TV host, and author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Other Wes Moore. And Wes didn't ask me to say this, but I urge you to read the book. Buy one for yourself, buy one for your kids, and buy one for everyone you know. The book it's a life changer. So thank you, Wes, for writing that. The insight is incredible. Wes has so many of the characteristics that were so important to my father. He's a great leader. He's a wonderful businessman. He is great with people. He has a tremendous smile. He really embodied. There's only one thing that my father probably wouldn't agree with Wes on, but because it's a different league, we'll take a pass. Wes is a huge Baltimore Ravens fan. But other than that, you guys would have gotten along great. And he does like Super Bowl winners, so. So this evening, it's also a really great pleasure to introduce another incredibly talented and busy man, Willie Geist, who is the co-host of the third hour of NBC's Today Show, as well as a co-host of MSNBC Morning Joe and a contributing editor to the NBC News programs, including the Nightly News with Brian Williams and Rock Center. And Willie, too, is a best-selling author. I may be the only one up here who's not, but the year is young. So this evening, Wes and Willie will be discussing something that both they and the Aspen Institute and so many of us in this room care a great deal about and have been involved with over the years, and that's the need of America's most recent veterans. In addition to having served in Afghanistan, Wes is on the board of IAVA, which is the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and Willie and his wife are involved with the UCLA Operation MEND, which was established to help treat U.S. military personnel wounded during service during the both Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So again, it's such a pleasure to have both of you here. We're in for a great treat tonight. Wes and I often email, and he usually ends his emails with elevate. And tonight, I promise you're in for a most elevated conversation. So gentlemen, elevate.
Well, that's a lot of A lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure.
Thank you so much, Lori, for the introduction. Thank you for all the work you do here in the city, and thank you most of all for my New York Giants. I sometimes wake up, sometimes wake up. We got 2 Super Bowls in the last couple of years, but that's okay.
True.
Sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, having grown up in this area, wondering what it must be like to be a Jets fan. Thank God it's only just a dream. But thank you for the Giants. Thank you to the Aspen Institute for hosting this wonderful event. I was feeling pretty good about our conversation here, feeling pretty confident, until someone came up to me in the room where Wes and I were standing a few minutes ago and said, FDR created the New Deal in this room. I said, well, the bar has been raised a little bit. So we really better elevate to get over that bar. This is, obviously, we've got a great man here. You've heard the introduction, not to inflate his ego anymore, but Rhodes Scholar, captain in the United States Army, served in Afghanistan, best-selling author, wonderful husband and father, my neighbor for a long time until he abandoned us for Baltimore a few months ago. His beautiful daughter, Mia, and my son, George, I feel are destined for marriage.
I approve. I approve already.
George is 3. We still have some work to do. But I'm really proud to call Wes my friend, and he truly is. He's already a great leader, but not just me, but a lot of smart people in this country believe he'll be one of this country's great leaders in the years to come. So we're very lucky to have Wes with us here today. You've been following the news. You know that our dear friend Hamid Karzai, our great ally, accused us a couple days ago, the United States, of colluding with the Taliban, which raised again the prospect of how and when we'll be getting out of Afghanistan. The timetable is the end of 2014. For a lot of people, that will mean the end of the war in Afghanistan after 13 years. But for all the U.S. servicemen and women coming home, it's just the beginning of something. So I think that's what we're here to talk about tonight. 2.5 million Americans up to this point have served between Iraq and Afghanistan. We've lost 4,475 in Iraq, more than 2,000 in Afghanistan, and more than 50,000 wounded in action. That's a lot of people who need our help. Those are a lot of families who are going to need our help. So we just want to get to some of the issues. We could never possibly even scratch the surface in an hour, but we want to talk through a few things and get some of your questions for Wes as well. So Wes, I guess I just start with a broad question and ask you why, in a country where we talk about how we love the troops and we're good at wearing pins and putting yellow ribbons around trees and everything else, and politicians do the same thing, why are we able to outwardly express verbally our appreciation, but then when they come home, we do such a bad job taking care of them?
Yeah, and first, again, thank you so much for the invitation, for hosting this. I'm surrounded by not just legends, but heroes of mine, and thank you. And one, I'd say, Willie, I don't know anybody who has used their perch more purposefully than you have. To talk about these issues again. You know, Willie Geist is not a newcomer to these issues, him nor his wife. So it just means a lot to sit here with you and talk about this as well. You know, it's interesting because, and it's actually very fitting to be in the Roosevelt House discussing this issue, because when we think about the war that he was the commander-in-chief of, World War II, that was a war where nearly 12% of the American population fought in World War II. So you really didn't find many people that did not have some type of direct connection to World War II. It was either, either I served, or my brother served, my sister served, my uncle served, whatever the case was, my neighbor served. Everyone had some kind of direct involvement, and everyone did their piece. And we had war bonds, et cetera. We had a whole national movement around this issue. We're now about to end the nation's longest war, where less than 1% of the American population has some type of direct involvement. And that, I think, strikes at the heart of the challenge that we have on this larger issue, where we've had, as you said, 2.5 million men and women who have gone and served in Iraq or Afghanistan, many of them for multiple tours. And the vast majority of Americans could not name one person that's done that. So that becomes part of the inherent challenge that we have. I think the other thing is, and I think this goes back to some of the challenges that a lot of veterans are having, is no one expected these wars to last this long. Even as we were first going through the process, people expected, I mean, I remember watching Meet the Press and hearing that, you know, we are going to be greeted as liberators. I remember watching the news reports and hearing people say how quick and easy this was going to be. And the fact is that we're now going on 12 years, 13 years, and we still have troops that are still overseas fighting. Literally, as we speak right now, we've got men and women who are fighting in the Korangal, men and women who are fighting in Asadabad, men and women who are fighting in Jalalabad and in Khost. And so I think we were not at all prepared for this length of conflict. One thing we always do in the military, and I see my good buddy Paul, you know, Paul Rykoff from IAVA, you know, one thing we're always taught in the military is you always train for both best case and worst case scenarios in every mission that you do. Even if your mission is as simple as we're going from point A to point B to drop off supplies, you always prepare for a worst case scenario. What happens if we get hit? What happens if something happens? And you prepare for that. Hope it doesn't happen, but you're prepared for it in the case that it does. That same level of conversation did not happen in this country about what was a worst case scenario if we were not greeted as liberators. What was a worst case scenario if once we uprooted the Taliban, what ends up happening was this vacuum was then created where you had anybody who had a rifle who tried to assume that vacuum. So these are things that I think, and it's taken a while for our country to really come around to the need and the necessity, which in my opinion, this really is, this is the moral imperative of our time. Because we cannot ask these young men and women to go overseas and fight. And I think, and you said it perfectly. You know, say we'll buy you a beer as you get off the plane, or we'll wear a pin, or maybe we'll even fly a flag in our lawn. But then we still have hundreds of days of waiting for VA claims and high unemployment rates, et cetera. This becomes our moral imperative to do something about this and now.
I'm glad you mentioned Paul Rykoff, a good friend of both of ours who runs IAVA. Paul, just stand up for 1 second. He's doing incredible work for our young veterans coming back, and we're grateful for that. Wes mentioned the 1% problem. I've got the numbers for you. 2.5 million have served. There are 314 million Americans. That works out to less than 0.8% of Americans who've served in one of the two wars that have consumed us for almost 12 years now. You mentioned a couple things I want to go back to. Unemployment. I think that's a good place to start. National average as of last Friday is 7.7%. For veterans, that number is 9.4%. Big question, why? Yeah. Why is it different for veterans? Do you think these are people who come back, who employers ostensibly appreciate, who have skills that the 99.2% don't have in terms of leadership and management? Why is that rate so high?
Well, I think there's a couple different reasons, and I think it's tiered as well. And what I mean by that is this. First, we have to also understand where a lot of the military personnel that we're talking about, where the baseline is. So I think we have to be honest, both as a veterans community and then also just as a national society, that there are a certain percentage of people who will enter the military, who for them the military was something where they just got out of school, they just got out of high school, they've now gone and they served 1 or 2 or 3 tours, and they might not yet have the skill set to be able to then transition into the different type of jobs, different type of occupations. So that is something I think we need to do a better job of addressing, is the fact that, you know, there are academic barriers to a lot of the veterans who are coming back, and there are job skill training barriers that are coming back. That's one section. There's another section though, and this is the one I think in many cases is much more damaging to the larger population, is I think there's 2 different stereotypes of veterans that exist primarily in the employment field. The first stereotype is that veterans are these ticking time bombs that are waiting to go off. And I think when we watch, you know, the things like the tragic things that happened with Chris Lyle, or what happened with, you know, Chris Dorner out in California, or whatever the case might be, that these are very easy things that people can just point towards and say, I told you so, about these individuals. So I think there's this impression that people think that these men and women are just waiting to go off, and it just takes a single trigger. It takes you telling them they did a bad job on something. It takes them showing up late and you asking why they were late. Next thing you know, that they're going to walk into the work next day with an AR-15, right? So I think, first of all, that stereotype is not only untrue, it's also unfair. The second thing is, I think there's this perception amongst a lot of employers that military personnel are almost like these robots. It's like, you know, yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, how high should I jump ma'am? Without understanding how amazingly entrepreneurial and creative these military veterans are. I mean, I think anybody, and I see, you know, quite a few veterans here, I think one thing that any veteran can tell you is that your Tuesday will not be like your Wednesday. And your Friday will not be like your Saturday. There's no basic preparation for what a deployment looks like. Every day is different. And every day you have to be on your feet. Every day you have to be on your toes. Every day is going to be a react to context situation where you then need to be responsible for not just yourself, but for the people who then will fall under you. And that is a completely underappreciated skill that I think so many military veterans have that people don't take into account, where they think that this is you know, something where if I tell them what to do, they'll be fine, but if I leave them to be creative, they won't be, because they'll just sit there and say, but you didn't give me an order, sir. That's not the way it works. You know, this young crop of veterans are incredibly entrepreneurial, incredibly creative. You look at this, the largest, you know, look at the congressional class right now. This is the largest class of veterans, of Iraq and Afghanistan, of young veterans that this nation has ever seen in this most recent congressional class. You've got social entrepreneurs like Paul, like Jake Wood, like Earl Johnson from Operation Oliver, people who are starting organizations, people who are running businesses. These are an amazing group, an amazing skill set that I think we have to do a better job of harnessing. And the other reason, and one thing that we see where, and it comes up to another issue that I think a lot of veterans are facing, was when you watch the unemployment rate of veterans, over the past 5 years, the unemployment rate of veterans literally tracks the suicide rate of veterans. And so if we cannot get our arms wrapped around this unemployment issue, it's going to be very difficult getting our arms wrapped around the other larger, nefarious, and dangerous issues that our veterans are facing as well.
So everything you just said is true. So then I wonder why employers don't recognize that or don't see it. I have a story, a friend of mine who's a veteran who said he went into a job interview with a human resources person and handed his resume, and the person read it and said, "Oh, this is impressive, but do you have any experience?" And he had to bite his tongue and said, "Well, let's see." Drove the Taliban out of the village, made it safe for the populace, created an economy, built a water filtration plant. I don't know, I've done a few things, I guess. Right. But it goes back to the 1% problem. A mutual friend of ours, a guy named Dan Senor, wrote a book called Startup Nation about Israel. And one of the premises of his book was that when there's compulsory military service, everyone gets it. They've all been in something together. They all share something. They all understand what makes the guy across the table special and extraordinary. As Wes said, we don't have that in this country. So my question is, the veterans have those skills. How do we now train employers, CEOs, and there are some doing the right thing. The CEO of Coke does this, among many others. How do we train employers what to look for and how to then appreciate it and see what it could do for their business? Not to hire a veteran as an act of charity or because it feels like the right thing to do, but because he or she can help your business.
And we're watching certain organizations that actually, I mean, you look at some of the work, like for example, like the Woodruff Foundation has done, or Robin Hood Foundation has done, where a lot of their focus really has been, how do we train employers to better understand this stuff? How do we help employers get it? You know, because as you said, I mean, because if I look at Sergeant Johnson, who's a squad leader that I served with in Afghanistan. This guy basically ran the platoon. This one squad leader basically ran the platoon. He was in charge of all of the SERF, which is the Commander's Emergency Relief Funds, in charge of all the machinery, all the mechanics, all this kind of stuff. I would put Sergeant Johnson in charge of anything that I saw back here. But then if you talk to Sergeant Johnson and you ask Sergeant Johnson to put what he did on paper, it is almost like it's Latin to someone who doesn't understand. When you talk about, I was in charge of, you know, $15 million of equipment, and you start putting all the military acronyms in it, it's very difficult for an employer who doesn't have a background to that to really translate that and understand that. I think the other thing, though, comes down to the specific barriers that do exist within the employment ratios for a lot of veterans. So, for example, if someone was a truck driver in Iraq, and someone was driving trucks in Iraq or Afghanistan, the fact that it would still take them 9 months to go through truck certification when they come back here makes 0 sense to me. So we don't do a good job of actually translating real work experience, and it might not be in the same direct application, but real work and real life experience into the actual workplace. So I think, you know, that's something that individual foundations, individual VSOs are really starting to get their arms wrapped around and trying to help people understand how do we help translate those natural deficiencies that, you know, the natural communication deficiencies that exist, but still a whole lot more work needs to be done both on the civilian side, but then also quite honestly on the military side, from the VA and from the DOD, as more and more men and women are now transitioning out.
So what would you like to see? How do we connect those two dots? What's something, the government can do, the private sector could do, the military could do together to raise this awareness. It seems to me we have this group of floating, talented people that are being wasted in an economy that needs them. How do we connect those dots?
Well, first, I think we need to do a better job as we're looking at the redeployment ratios. So, for example, over this next year, we're going to have approximately 30 to 35,000 men and women who will be coming from Afghanistan and redeploying back to the United States this year alone. And to be completely frank, 2012 was a very difficult year for the veterans community. And unless someone can show me something different, I'm not seeing many trends in 2013 that are looking any more positive. And so doing a better job of helping that transition take place, helping soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and Coast Guardsmen think about this process, even as they're still in uniform, about what that transition actually looks like. Coming up with specific mentorship programs where you have people who have successfully made the transition that can then have established networks and established partnerships with those who are getting ready to make the transition. Another thing that I think we've seen is that, to be completely honest, to rely solely on the VA on this has not been a process that has worked very well for our veterans community. One, because the transition, when I'm wearing the uniform, I fall under DoD classification, Department of Defense classification. Literally, the day after I get out, all my paperwork, all my files, no longer is with the DoD. If I have a question, I don't call the DoD anymore. I now have to call the VA. That transition process is completely shattered. Completely shattered. And so we have to do a better job of making that transition take place from DoD filing to VA filing, and then helping the person actually feel like they're not just getting completely lost in the shuffle and lost in the process. That's also where the importance of VSOs such as IAVA, VSOs such as the Team Rubicons of the world, the Operation Olivers of the world, et cetera, become so incredibly instrumental, because if you can partner their hands-on understanding of the situation with the larger budgetary issues that DoD and the VA, et cetera, then start working on, then we can actually start seeing real progress. I think you're absolutely right, though. Part of the challenge is that we have a lot of people who end up working in silos, and then the conversations, people who are supposed to be helping, they end up not part of the conversation, but they end up just simply being subjects of the conversation, and they feel that.
You mentioned the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Let's get into that a little bit. By the end of this month, there will be 1 million claims in a VA system that's ill-equipped to handle that many and unprepared to do so.
Yep.
The average wait time, this is a new report that came out just this week that Paul and the IAVA brought to our attention. Average wait time for a veteran to collect benefits is between 316 and 327 days, almost 1 year. You gasp at that. Wait till you hear these numbers. In New Orleans, that number rises to 490 days. In Los Angeles, it's 619 days. Houston, 586. Here in New York City, veterans wait 642 days on average to collect their benefits. The highest number we found was in Reno, Nevada, where they wait 681 days to collect their benefits from the time they put in their claim. How to dig through all that. First of all, let's talk about the machinery of the VA. A lot of people will say they're doing the best they can with what they have. It's inefficient. They can't handle it. There are a lot of private groups who help ease it a little bit, but this is untenable. It's unacceptable. These were promises made to these men and women when they entered the military that they'd be taken care of quickly when they got home. If you have 681 days to sit around and you don't have a job and you have an injury that prevents you from working, bad things can happen in those 2 years.
If someone calls up and says, I need to see a doctor, and you tell that person they're going to have to wait 2 months to see a doctor, don't even set up the appointment. They're not going to make it. And I know you know that, I know Paul knows, I have my old roommate who was the graduate almost in the top of his class, went on to West Point, was a very successful lieutenant and eventually captain in the United States Army as an infantryman, served 3 tours, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. A month ago took his own life. He was recently married. He married an Army psychologist. And his wife came home one day, and she came home, she opened the door, and she saw him laying on the floor because he had killed himself. I don't blame the VA. I think they're all very well-intentioned. I think they're good people who decide to give up their own private lives to go serve in the government that they love and to go serve a population that they care about. I blame the structure that they're then forced to work in. I blame the fact that we have a system that is completely unprepared to deal with the kind of numbers that we're talking about and deal with the challenges that we're talking about. If you look at the way the VA is set up, 97% of all VA claims are processed on paper. They're processed on paper. Mm-hmm. What agency functions like this? What agency properly functions like this? So I feel like the challenge is that when we're making these decisions about war, we still have not figured out that you cannot make decisions about war and conflict unless you also think about what are going to be the long-term consequences and implications. I challenge anybody who thinks it's any commander-in-chief who says they want to put troops in battle, and they bring the Secretary of Defense into the room and they bring the National Security Advisor into the room, make sure the Secretary of Veterans Affairs is in the room too. Make sure the Secretary of the VA is there too. Because they're the one that's going to have to deal with the brunt of the conflicts that continue to go on and inefficient systems that are then longer and unprepared to then take on this level of trauma and challenge. And it's one thing for if a veteran has a VA hospital that's, you know, in relative close distance, or, you know, if, you know, but we have veterans who, if you're living over in West Texas, you're traveling 200 miles to get into a VA hospital. How exactly can we ask this transition to work any smoother? And how are we then able to respond to the so many cries for help that come out for these men and women who come back and need and deserve every drop of support that we have not been prepared to give them? When we see these numbers and we see about, you know, and I look at, you know, quite honestly, my hometown of Baltimore is one of the worst offenders of this. The VA in Baltimore is to this point, and again, they hate when I say this, but it's true, it's broken beyond belief. The treatment that a veteran will come back to the city of Baltimore will get is horrendous. And unless we can structure a system to not just put more, it's not even simply just about more resources behind the area, but actually a better psychological understanding of the challenges that people are facing and the opportunities that lie within, we see these type of numbers, and quite honestly, these numbers have only gotten worse over the process of these conflicts.
We solicited Facebook questions, and this just goes to one of your points. This is Kevin Frazier, who's a veteran. He wrote, what happens to vets who can't hold or perform a job when they return? When you receive nothing to live on, you place your life on the line, you pay the price, you get pennies to try to survive. I've been waiting for just under 2 years on my request for an upgrade in the allowance due to the injury I received in service, 2 years. And it's gotten to the point that I'm non-employable. He goes on to say, mental trauma happens, marital distress happens. Are we talking about a question of not enough money appropriated to the VA? Are we talking about it just being a completely inefficient system? Because people will see these in the age of Facebook and Twitter and everything being streamlined and you can have anything you want overnight. The fact that a veteran calls and says, something's wrong with me, I need to see a doctor or a psychologist, and he has to wait 30 days, 60 days, whatever it is, and in that time takes his own life, that just can't happen.
Yeah.
So where do we begin to tackle this massive bureaucracy and make it modern and efficient so it addresses needs quicker than 681 days?
Well, I think part of it is it's an underfunded issue, and I think that is part of it. And quite honestly, you know, we look at some of the debates taking place in Washington right now, and these have been amazingly unhelpful. Specifically to the veterans community. I mean, I would hear people make debates and say, like, well, sequestration really isn't going to be that bad. To who? Who won't it be that bad to? Because I can tell you right now, there are a lot of veterans who completely lost tuition assistance because of sequestration. Tell them it's not that bad. Tell them it doesn't matter. So when we have these larger debates about what matters and what's important and, oh, we can figure it out, for a lot of people who really rely on that support and deserve that support, that's just not true. And that's just not accurate. So I think part of it is an underfunding situation. The other thing is, I think we have to do a better job of helping people understand when we say we want to support veterans, helping them to understand what exactly that means. And I think part of it does go back to the issue that we were speaking about earlier, was the fact that we have so many people in this country who do not have a direct attachment to these conflicts. When you talk to people about what's going on in Afghanistan, the reaction for the vast majority of people is one of two things. It's either, we're still doing that, or it's, why are we still doing that? All right? And we need that level of leadership to come from the highest levels of government to the highest levels of entertainment to the highest levels of every single industry and work its way all the way down. Because as we're having, and again, you know, I'm just being completely frank, you know, when we hear the State of the Union address recently given, and the word veteran is mentioned once, this becomes something where if we're going to have an honest conversation, if we're going to see real movement on this, it has got to be shouted about from every single level and from every single corner. Because the truth is, as these wars are coming to an end, you were spot on. For the people that are coming back home, the wars for many of them are just beginning. And my fear is that as the conflict continues to wind down, and as people are no longer concerned, we're no longer watching deployment schedules and all this kind of stuff, that people think that everything is now over. We saw a similar type of dynamic, and again, there were different trends and different phenomenons, and I understand that and appreciate that. But we saw the same thing with wars of the past. We saw the same things with Vietnam. We saw the same things with Korea. We saw the same things with wars of the past, where as the wars wound down, the understanding and the appreciation for the warriors who then had to fight them diminished. We can't have that happen again this time around, because there are far too many people who are already in pretty tenuous situations, and that becomes much more tenuous to our larger economic and, quite honestly, our social impact.
You mentioned suicides as well as a big problem. Last year, for the first time, it made a lot of headlines. There were more active duty suicides than combat deaths in Afghanistan. Suicides up last year 16%, 349 active duty suicides in 2012. So to me, that goes back to us taking care of, these are active duty, but also we had a lot of veterans take their own lives. There has to be a better way than calling and waiting 60 days when I have an urgent problem and I feel like I'm going to do something bad to myself. Yeah. So beyond pouring money and putting more government money on top of the VA, which I agree we need more of, how do we make this more efficient? How do we make it more effective? How do we target the people who need the help?
And the other thing is, in those numbers were the active duties. For veterans, the number is 22 veterans a day
per day
commit suicide. Part of the reason is there's a larger sense of hopelessness that I think that exists for so many people who then end up redeploying. Well, they'll come out of the military with an understanding, well, you know, when I get out, I'll do X or I'll do Y, and my family can do X, Y, and Z, and then so on. And then as days go on, and you realize that's just not going to be our reality, that can become amazingly frustrating. We are inherently a very hopeful and optimistic people. We continue moving on because we have a firm belief that our tomorrow is going to be better than our today. When you take that hope away from somebody, it's very difficult to then be able to navigate for the rest of your life, particularly if you're then supporting something bigger than yourself, if you've got a family, if you've got kids, if you've got a wife or a husband that is then dealing with a lot of these other ancillary issues. So I think the best way, so in addition to doing things like being able to do better in terms of treatment facilities and that kind of thing, I think the other thing is we have to do a better job of addressing what is it that's causing this level of hopelessness. Why is it that we have people who feel like they are unemployable? Why is it that we have people who will go on to an institution of higher education? And Congress, in fairness to Congress, you know, they passed a very generous new GI Bill years ago. And if you look at the graduation rates amongst veterans who will then go on to institutions of higher education using that GI Bill, it's actually atrocious watching the lack of graduation that takes place. And so if we can do a better job of being able to track, retain, and then help the success ratios of those who go on to higher education, looking for individual things they can do with their life and you know, do with their skill sets. In addition to that, do a better job of actually coming up with pipelines and true employment pipelines for these veterans. I think we're going to make a significant dent on things like suicide rates and things like depression, because that is, in many cases, that's what's causing this level of depression. It's depression for so many men and women is being caused and being compounded by this sense of hopelessness that they feel when they come home, and they felt that if I would have just joined the military, things would be different. If I just joined the Army and spent some time, my life would be different. And then they come back from 1 or 2 or 7 deployments, and they realize it's not. That can really wear on someone's soul. And so if we really want to address some of those other issues, we can immediately do a better job of addressing some of the other ancillary issues that then end up compounding and causing this level of frustration and disillusionment.
You talked about how frustrating and disillusioning it must be to have served 1, 2, 3, 4 tours and to come back to a country where you're not recognized, or there are 314 million people who don't acknowledge that that war took place. It could build a certain level of resentment. One of our Facebook questions comes from a gentleman who says, as a teacher and former coach of a number of vets, I'm concerned about their mental health. I've talked with so many that seem to have absolute disdain for civilians upon return. It's the you couldn't possibly understand mindset, which adds to the isolation in some veterans.
And I just say, I think for a lot of veterans, it's not even just among the civilian population. For a lot of us, it was even amongst our families. You know, I remember, so for example, when I came back, and I'm a firm believer that everybody who gets deployed comes back different. It doesn't mean we all come back damaged, but we all come back different. And I remember the things that a lot of people, the things that people have challenges with and difficulties with, for someone who might not have gone through the process, might not even fully understand. So for example, when I came back, I had problems with lights. I'm sorry, lights. Lights. Because when you're in a place where you have 100% light security for a year, where it's like, you know, where everything is either green lights or red lights, and when I say green lights or yellow lights, green lights or red lights, it's because you cannot see green or red or red lights from far away. So when the sun went down, you didn't have on white lights and buildings. So it's like, because obviously, if you had a white lights can be seen from miles and miles away. So if you did have a building with white lights, like, so good luck getting sleep that night, right? And so to go from that to literally 2 weeks later being in Times Square, that kind of does something to you. And and my wife, you know, and she tells the story better than I do, when I would go around the house and almost like follow behind her turning off lights. And she didn't understand what was going on. But she also was in this position where she's like, I want to ask questions, but I'm afraid. Do I ask questions and then have him get upset because I'm asking questions, or do I stay silent and have him get upset because I'm staying silent? And so then the general almost default answer is, I just say nothing. Right. And then when that happens, the problem with it is then I feel like you don't care about what I've been through. You don't care about what I've seen. You don't care about my soldiers that I then served with. And so I think it's even broader than even simply just a societal issue. I think this even breaks down to the families, who in many cases, and again, one of the real takeaways I took from deployment was, as tough as I thought I had it, the people who really had it toughest are the families. Because we had good days and we had bad days, but we always had each other. We leaned on each other. My wife and my mom, at that time my fiance and my mom, who were they leaning on? They were just watching news reports, and they were hearing that, you know, 2 soldiers were killed in Kunar Valley. And then they're just sitting there and hoping that their phone doesn't ring. So being able to help prompt that level of conversation, being able to prompt that level of curiosity about it is a very real phenomenon where people are getting off the plane and again, they're you know, the lead story is Justin Bieber crashing his Lamborghini.
That was huge, though.
That was a big deal. That was a big deal. That was a big deal.
In fairness, that was huge.
Bad example. Bad example.
I'm a newsman.
But you know, and you know, so but you know, one of the things, and not to keep on picking on Paul in the back, but when the Ad Council did a campaign with IEVA, you know, really helping not just veterans understand that they're not alone, but then also doing a very good job of helping families know that they're not alone in this either. That you can ask questions, that you can reach out, that there are other angles. Watching even what's happening with the First Lady joining forces. I mean, these are important components to being able to stimulate a larger conversation, and quite honestly, a conversation that is not just overdue, but incredibly necessary right now.
We've talked a lot about IAVA, also Team Rubicon,
yes.
Another group.
And Operation Mend.
And Operation Mend is another great one.
Yeah.
How important are these groups in supplementing what the government is able to do? We talked about Operation Mend, just to explain a little more. It's at the UCLA Medical Center, and they perform reconstructive surgery for servicemen who've come back and been completely disfigured by IEDs. And if you go to their website and you look at the before and after, it might be difficult for a second, but they are working miracles out there. So what happens is they come off the battlefield, they go to Brooke Army Medical Center near San Antonio, and they get one level of coverage, and then if they move up and it's severe enough, they go to UCLA. But if there was no Operation Mend and no UCLA Medical Center, their coverage would end at Brooke, where they're doing the best they can, and they're doing a great job with the resources they have. But these guys, Corporal Aaron Mankin, Marine, who's a friend of ours.
Amazing.
He's got 2 little kids. When I tell you his face was about blown off, it was. And if you saw him today, you'd notice something. But he's out in the world, he's confident, he's proud, he plays with the little kids, he looks great. And they've done about 60 of these operations for these people. My point is, it's a long way to say, is it's the private sector helping out the government.
That's right. And quite honestly, had it not been for the Operation Men's, had it not been for the Stop Soldier Suicides, had it not been for the Team Rubicons, had it not been for the Operation Oliver's, had it not been for a whole collection and slew of just really efficient and important VSOs, Veteran Service Organizations, I really don't know where the veteran cause would be right now. Because I think what you had was a lot of people who fully understood the level of need and fully also understood the insufficient level of support inherently that comes in. And granted, we've also we're in very tough economic times. We're in times when the national unemployment rate has hit 7 and 8 and 9+%. So I get the challenges that we're facing. But that's why the support of these VSOs, I mean, you look at Operation Men as a great example. I mean, these people are plastic surgeons who make a lot of money doing what they do.
It's LA. Yeah.
It's LA. They make a lot of money doing what they do. But they've then decided that, all expense, all costs taken care of, they're going to help out a Corporal Aaron Mencken feel comfortable going back outside because he never wanted to leave his house. So the VSOs become incredibly important in terms of helping to bridge the gap. And now the challenging thing about VSOs is this, we have, and Paul, you wouldn't tell me the number, but how many veterans organizations are there right now? But I mean, like ballpark, it's tens of thousands, 40,000, right? So that becomes part of the challenge as well. Is we have everybody who has a veterans organization. I think the key thing is, and particularly for those who want to help and support and identify who are some organizations that are really doing some interesting work, you have things like Charity Navigator. You have things where you're actually able to identify who are the 4-star charities, who are the ones who have proven, have quantitative analysis in terms of the work that they do and in terms of the people that they support. And those are the ones I think we need to, such as the Operation Men's, and the IVAs. Those are the ones who we really need to make sure we're targeting and supporting. And the Wounded Warrior Foundation, another one, Wall Street Warfighters. These are ones that I think have just shown time and time again that they're really good at what they do. And when I say they're really good at what they do, it means they're saving lives.
Mm-hmm. It's not cheap, though. Operation Men, everyone, to take a patient all the way through is $500,000. So, and you consider how many patients they have who need the service. That's a lot of money. So I could talk to you all day, but I want to get some questions from the audience as well, because I know they're champing at the bit. Okay, well, why don't we start in the front while we get the mic to everybody.
Thank you, and thank you for your passion. No surprise, Wes, I've known you for a long time, and Willie, your passion and commitment to this too. I want to come back to this 1% point, or this 0.8% point. It seems to me there's another dimension of this that explains a lot, and including even maybe how easy it is for wars to be fought, even if they're not declared. And that is that it's different zip codes.
Yes.
You know, if you go 3 or 4 zip codes north of here, most people do know people who serve.
Yeah.
If you go to a little, you know, decaying mill town in Ohio, most people do know people who've served. If you go to a poor place in the Mississippi Delta, you know a lot of people who have served. But for most people in middle and upper middle class America, unlike any previous wars, they don't know anyone. It used to be with rich, middle class, poor, cities, country. People served together. And that had implications. It also had implications on citizenship and attitude towards one country and attitude toward people who were different from one's own. But I wonder, Wes, if you'd comment on that dimension of this, not just the fact that it's a small number, but for so many people who have power in this country, wars are being fought by other people's children.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I hear, and I could not agree more. If you look at the geographic breakdown, in fact, it was a fascinating stat. I was talking to someone about this about 6 months ago, but they were saying that 34% of the people who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan come from approximately somewhere between 35 and 50 different counties within the country. So you're absolutely right. We're talking about pockets of the country that are taking on heavy brunts of the weight of, and a lot of them happen to be in poor rural areas. A lot of them happen to be in the South. A lot of them happen to be in places that are not necessarily close to where we're sitting right now. Which I think in many cases it does make it a whole lot easier for people to make decisions about how a war should be fought or how easily we can fight when it's not necessarily their child or themselves who are then going to have to fight. And my mother always says, my mother said, I never got active or involved in war issues until it was my son who had to deploy. She said, then I got really active. And I started thinking really seriously about what are we doing and why should we be doing this, because it became very personal to her at that point. And so now I have to say this. So while I don't necessarily, I'm not a person who's in favor of a draft per se, because I think there are challenges that come in with that as well, and I can go into that as well. However, what I am in favor of, and again, I'm very proud of the work that the Aspen Institute is actually doing around this issue as well, is this idea of actually doing a better job of encouraging a sense of service amongst the people in this population. We have national models around the world that show this, that show certain level of civic involvement, that show certain level of civic engagement, and what it means to the long-term cause, what it means to decisions about war and peace, what it means to decisions about policy making later on in the future, because everyone feels like they have some type of vested sense of interest. Part of the reason why Dan Senor's book about Starved Nation was so powerful, he said, in Israel, there's no choice about this. You serve. And when you end up coming out, and again, you serve, your requisite period of time. And some people decide to stay, some people do not. But when you end up coming out, at least you end up with some type of an understanding of what that decision means when you decide to say you're going to send people, men and women, into harm's way. So while I'm not necessarily in favor of a draft per se, I am very much in favor of being able to truly build out this sense of service inside of this country. Whether that means serving in a rural or urban school district, whether that means helping to build homes, whether that means supporting veterans who are coming back home, whether that means supporting seniors. Having something, knowing that you're part of something bigger than yourself, makes a tremendous difference in terms of the decisions that you'll make and the policies that you will then later on advocate for.
Keep it in the front, and then we'll work our way back. We can hear you. Go ahead. We'll repeat the question if we need to.
So I think that we've actually got, although there's still a ton of problems and not a lot of solutions, I actually think we've gotten reasonably good in this country about talking about challenges for returning veterans, PTSD and traumatic brain injury, everything we talk about. One thing I don't think we've gotten very good about is lifting up the positives that come with veterans.
Yes.
You know, you
Right.
mentioned hiring as like a charitable kind of thing.
Right.
And I don't think we've gotten great about, you know, lifting up stories of leadership and accomplishments and real skills that come home. And so I think that we still have a challenge on that. But I think in particular, there's an even bigger challenge with female veterans. So female veterans do make up about 14% of the services across the board.
Yep.
And now that we've opened up all aspects and all roles to female service members, so what's even a bigger challenge for them is that most of the national stories about female service members are around sexual assault.
Yeah.
So that ends up becoming like the first thing that comes to our mind.
Right.
So how do we set them up for better success? Like now that they will be in every area, although I would argue they've been in many areas already.
Yeah.
But so how do we set them up for better success when those are the national narratives?
Great question, Emily, and thanks for the work that you're doing on this as well. But it's, you know, it's interesting because I remember when the whole debate was taking place about allowing women into you know, combat arms roles, and I was asked about my opinion. My opinion was kind of like, I don't even know why this is a debate. I mean, women have been serving combat roles since you know, since these wars have even begun. I mean, if you have a woman who's an MP, don't tell me that they haven't seen the same kind of combat and haven't seen the same type of situational challenges that any man has. And also, it does bring up the idea of you know, promotion levels, because if you want to be a 4-star general, you had better be a combat arms person, that kind of thing. So the fact is that you're absolutely right. Women have been playing such an oversized role in these conflicts for so long and just have not been receiving the same level of recognition for them. One of the things that I think we actually, and one of the things that we're actually trying to do, and I see Molly Fowler here as well, is, you know, we're working on this project right now. It's called Coming Home, and it'll be airing on PBS starting in November, in Veterans Day, so in November, and it's going to be a mini series. And basically, what it is, it tries to address that exact issue, where we know about the suicide rates, we know about the PTSD, we know about the unemployment rates, we know these things. And the problem is that for so many people, the stats are so disheartening that eventually our eyes just glaze over because we think there's nothing we can do. That this is so bad that where do we even begin? So since there's nowhere to begin, why are we even talking about it? What we're really hoping to do with Coming Home is challenge that exact assertion. Is say, you know what, there are some issues that people are dealing with. We get it, we understand it, we're not going to shade over them. However, that's not the whole story. We've got some amazing men and women who are coming back home, who are running for office. Amazing men and women who are starting organizations. Amazing men and women who are leading businesses and being part and leading conversations. I mean, and that in many ways has been our national history. If you look at the people who are helping to lead the civil rights movement, these are people who came back from World War II with a general frustration, the fact that they were treated better overseas than they were in the country that they were fighting for. So many people who took up frontline positions, so many people of color, so many African Americans who took up frontline positions were veterans because they said this is unreal. The fact that we're still not treated with a sense of equality for a country that we are wearing their flag on our shoulder. So being able to help tell those stories, being able to help profile and lift up and build up and help to change the dynamic and the psychology, both internally and externally, of our veterans community is something that I think, you know, we're very excited about, but very committed to, because you know, I think as you very appropriately said, Willie, you know, our veterans who are coming back home, they're not a charity, they're an investment, as long as we use that investment wisely.
I spent a decade and a half in the startup nation economy over there, and one interesting aspect of it is that medical device is a huge part of what they do, and a lot of that's focused on battlefield medicine. And I think one aspect of what we're talking about here is that the reason that there's 50,000 names on the wall for Vietnam, and we've been a lot more efficient in these wars of not necessarily having people die on the battlefield, is that a lot of people whose names probably would have been connected to the you know, the dead and severely wounded are actually making it back, and it's not much. Unfortunately, you know, we figured out how to keep people alive and get them back, but it's not a lot of quality of life.
Yeah.
You know, and if your statistics are right, that 7,500 people are committing suicide a year at 22 a day, you know, that's having a lot to do with quality of life that they have and feeling that they maybe should have died on the battlefield or whatever. A huge chunk of that is. But I think your other point about integrating back with the family is such a huge part of this, and I'd recommend to people, Ellen Sabin, who's sitting next to me, has done a book for children, you know, of veterans that I think is interesting. It's not just a children's book, but they have to fill in, you know, chunks of the book themselves about how it felt to touch dad's amputated arm or whatever. You know, they have to work through some of those issues. So we got a lot of family integration issues. And I guess the one comment I'd make that about a program that I don't see out there is I think there needs to be some kind of a prize annually set up to sort through all the tons and tons of programs to see if we can't find some sort of a juried way to start to identify those programs that really are moving the needle and making a difference, because unfortunately there's a lot of, you know, people with a big heart about somebody who died who try to set something up, but it's really not got the administrative heft to be able to get anything done. And secondly, unfortunately, there's people who are taking advantage of heartstring type issues and are raising money around programs that really have a lot of administrative costs and aren't really delivering a lot of benefits. So I think one of the things that's missing from the situation today, and I'd love your comment, is really about whether or not there's some way to start analyzing and rank ordering the things that really are effectively moving the needle.
Absolutely, and actually I want to, in fact, if Paul, if you can just stand up and just talk a little bit about the new initiative that's taking place with veterans organizations and how exactly to fund and support the ones that are doing the work.
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Paul didn't know he was going to work today.
Yeah, no, sorry, Paul.
Yeah, we're used to getting thrown into the fire, so we're good at it. First of all, thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you guys for leading such an important conversation. Bottom line is that we know the veteran space is new to a lot of people. It didn't really exist, for the most part, until after 9/11. So there's been a huge startup, an explosion of an industry, really, that didn't exist before. So what's happening now is a best-in-class is emerging. Folks like Robinhood and Aspen and others are help creating that. Metrics are being defined. Leadership is clarifying. Foundations are finally getting involved. I'll tell you that until recently, most major foundations didn't give to veterans. They say we do poverty or we do unemployment. We don't do veterans, not realizing that there was a need or maybe an existing programmatic component. So the bottom line is that we've been kind of waiting for everyone else to sort it out, and it hasn't sorted itself out, so we're going to sort it out. And we started something called the Veteran Support Fund that will bring together Operation MEND, the NMFA, the National Military Families Association, Operation Homefront, and us, and there's one other I'm forgetting right now, but the five kind of leaders from different industries are coming together to help clarify that for America. There are other initiatives that will be out there as well, so you'll be able to compare and contrast and find out where your dollar can go effectively. But it is an important space that still, surprisingly, does not have much money in it. And we often compare it to the AIDS space 30 years ago, a huge growth of public demand, public health demand, and an industry that hadn't responded, government hadn't responded, philanthropy hadn't responded. So the parallels are actually pretty strong. But that's a short answer, and happy to send you all more information. It's on our website if you go to iava.org.
Hey, Paul, while you have the mic in your hand, can you just talk for 1 second about, because you just launched this, the Career Pathfinder that you all are helping vets find jobs, how that works exactly?
Sure. So folks have a hard time interpreting their skills, creating resumes, finding jobs. So about a week and a half ago, we launched an online program called Career Pathfinder with Cisco. And there are about 10,000 jobs on the back end. We've got about 200,000 members on the front end, and Cisco has designed a tool to create a translation between the two. So now vets can go to one place and get the support they need. In addition, there's mental health and education support wrapped around it. But it's a way to try to create a match, which is a huge challenge right now, and achieve scale, because everybody can't go to an employment fair or a job fair. Those are fine to some extent, but they're inefficient. They don't scale. They don't really meet the needs of a 21st century job market. So we're trying to use technology to bridge that gap, and we've already had almost 2,000 vets use it just in the first 10 days or so. So there's a huge need out there, and if you've got a job, now we've got a clear pipe to fit on the back end of it. If you've got a job, we can put it in the back end. That connects it with this tool and the veterans around the country who are looking for jobs.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm sorry, can you tell me the name of your book?
The name of the book is The Healing Heroes Book, Breaking the Changes When Someone You Love is Wounded in Service. And it was created to support children who have a family member wounded in service.
Great.
It was requested by Admiral Mullen, and I ended up having the honor, as you spoke about Brooke Army and Walter Reed, and spending a couple months in both institutions and doing a lot of interviews. And finding, one of the things that I found in it, as you were talking about spouses, was what I found was the next generation is also highly impacted by wounded service members. And not only has it become my belief that they deserve good stability in their families, and that those who have been wounded depend on healthy families. And that means spouses, and that means children who are well equipped to deal with and sustain going through transitions with their loved ones. But I also believe that so many of those who go into the service go in because they have family members who are in the service.
Yeah.
And that if we don't take care of this generation, we're going to have a problem in the future recruiting the next generation of those who serve.
That's right.
Because they see the wounds, they see how the wounds are treated, and they either weather it well or they don't. So my book, which just came out in December, seeks to support those who, families.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I was curious to know whether you have studied or evaluated how, for example, the French or the British are dealing with their returning vets and how they treat them and what they receive from the government, or is it better? Is it different?
It's a great question. I know I've looked at it from the British perspective and from the British model. And so there's two components to remember about that. One is the numbers are nowhere near. So they have done a much better job of being able to reintegrate, reincorporate back in. Part of it is just it's a numbers issue, and it's a mass issue that the United States has on this, because the United States has taken up a lion's share of the kinetic operations in these two conflicts. But the other thing is that they have done a better job, and again, this is just the Brits, have done a better job for their population of the reintegration, and particularly on the pipeline back to employment issues. So for example, as they're having people who are then making the transition either from active duty or from the reserves, they either have jobs that have held spots for a job they used to have, or they then have pipelines for their people to do a much better job of the reintegration process. And also hence why they don't have anywhere near the same type of issues of both unemployment and also suicide rates that we're seeing amongst veterans amongst the United States. Another issue, and again, I'm not trying to get political or anything along those lines, but the fact is the access to guns that people have makes suicide a whole lot easier. And if you have societies and places where you don't have the same level of access and have the same propensity for firearms to be around, it makes you have to think that much harder about how this is going to take place. And I think that actually then also lends to the dynamic as well.
Do you think they treat these issues differently because, let's say, the British were a country that was attacked during the Second World War, and their whole mentality is different? We've never really been formally attacked until 9/11, and the French was an occupied country.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I never thought about it from that perspective. I do know that that specifically for Iraq, where at least in Afghanistan, the idea of coalition forces really was a genuine term. I mean, we all ended up fighting over in Afghanistan with people from the UK and people from Germany and people from Japan, and so it really was a much larger coalition. Versus Iraq, it was very much an American force that was fighting over in Iraq, and really didn't see the same kind of coalition involvement and coalition pressures that took place. So it's an interesting point to look at it from that perspective. But I think a lot of it really does come down to, we really took on a brunt of the conflict, both financial and also physical and kinetic, with both Iraq and Afghanistan, but specifically with Iraq.
Totally have time for two more.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's really important.
Thank you.
My husband was in the Army for 14 years. He trained at Brooke Army Medical Center, and I worked for the 5th Corps in Germany. And while this sounds like a really awfully cheesy name, we developed a reintegration program called Desert Calm. And we worked a lot with families before the units came back. And I just really want to encourage everyone to remember always, whenever you have the opportunity, to always ask the question. So you said sometimes people get nervous if I say something, they'll get mad, and you don't know how they're going to respond or react. But truly, it's so important, because even if they do react or they don't, it may be the first time that someone's saying, how do you feel? And I'm ready to hear the answer. It's okay. And the reintegration, you know, obviously has so many factors, and all of these things that you've spoken about are so important. And the question becomes, you know, what are the next steps? How can those of us in this room, whether it's support, whether it's action, whether it's our voice, you know, let us do something. Let us know how we can continue to help and be supportive, and it does matter so much. So thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, and thank you. And you know, and the great thing about, and I'll be brief, but the great thing about this is, I mean, the span of influence in this room is amazingly oversized. You know what I mean? I mean, you know, you guys have more sway and influence and push than you could possibly imagine, specifically on this issue. So, to be frank, I think there are a few things that people can do. You know, one is, as I think, being able to identify who are the VSOs that are doing work in the specific areas that you might care most about. So if the thing that you really want to spend time on and really get you know, all of our heads wrapped around is the issues of suicide prevention, and you want to learn about the work of Stop Soldier Suicide or some of these organizations, or if you're like, I really want to figure out ways to help out the employment pipeline, or figure out ways of you know, tracking where veterans come back and they can do continued service, and you talk about things like Team Rubicon and the mission continues, et cetera. I mean, find out what exactly is going to be your passion point, and then figure out who are the people that are doing the best work on it, and figure out ways of supporting them. I think another thing that becomes incredibly important is making sure that our elected officials don't forget about us. Making sure that elected officials don't forget about that this is an incredibly important, not just population, but quite honestly, a national moral imperative. Because for these 2.6 million people who have been fighting these wars, you know, we can't just, again, simply just thank them for their service and then keep it moving. We need to make sure our elected officials know that we're not going to stop talking about them, and we're not going to take them out of our thoughts and out of our prayers and out of our minds as we start advocating for issues that are important to us. So as we're having debates about things like, as I said earlier, about sequestration, and people can sit there and rationalize about, well, it won't be that painful. It will be to a lot of people.
Thanks a lot. Piggybacking on the zip codes question, is there a difference in the unemployment and also suicide rates among officers and enlisted men and women? And also, with regard to pipelines to employment, it sounds like some of the programs now do rely on charity, whereas could there be more official incentives for private organizations that might be a good fit for veterans to employ them, tax incentives or otherwise?
Yeah, great question. On the first question, on the statistical percentage basis, the answer, and maybe surprisingly for many people, is no. You know, so for example, I mean, I think about, you know, of the 3 friends in the past 18 months I know who have committed suicide, 2 of them are officers. And so what ends up happening is, and I think this is kind of a phenomenon we see for a lot of personnel, is who's helping the helpers. Because for an officer, you're very focused on, as you're getting redeployed and you're sending your soldiers back home, you're very focused on making sure that your people are okay. You're very focused on making sure that, you know what, Sergeant so-and-so who's having some issues, I need to make sure that she gets a little extra attention. You know, Corporal so-and-so, I need to make sure that he makes sure he goes and sees his docs and, you know, X, Y, and Z. And then the question then becomes, but who's helping you? You went through this process too. You saw the same type of things, you're dealing with the same type of thing, but it's also now compounded because you've got people that you then have to support. At some point, you lay your armor down. And we have a lot of people who are dealing with these wounds and wearing these masks There's a great poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar. It goes, we wear the mask that grins and lies, and it hides our teeth and it shades our eyes. This debt we pay for human guile, with broken and bleeding hearts we smile. And continues on. But that, for so many people, for so many officers, you have exactly where they are wearing the mask. And then when it's time for them to actually put the rucksack down, the pain and the wounds that they feel are still very real, and they haven't figured out ways of dealing with it. So I think that's a great point of figuring out that there actually is not a percentage basis. There actually are incentives, some that have been laid out for companies to actually do a better job of employing vets. If you can hire a certain percentage of veterans where they receive certain tax breaks. Walmart just had a very big announcement where they said any vet who wants a job will have a job at Walmart. So you're watching businesses that are trying to do work and trying to think about these things, relatively creatively, and build out this process. The challenge has been it hasn't been coordinated and it hasn't been scaled. And still the differences can still be very antiquated, whether it be state benefits versus local benefits versus federal benefits. And so I think there has to be a way of actually tying this stuff together and coordinating it better.
Was there one more before we go? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to bring the question back to the VA and its malfunctions. Those are shocking statistics that you gave us about how long veterans have to wait, from 1 year to 2 years or even beyond that. And I wonder if there's been any discussion about some kind of way to improve the VA in terms of, say, a public-private partnership. We have corporations in this country which have the skills and the technology to address those problems. And in fact, historically, we've had those kind of partnerships. Social Security was set up on a contract with IBM, 12 million people, and it started automated. And you're telling me that the VA is still 97% paper, and this is 60, 70 years later. Is there any way to mobilize the corporate sector of this country to come in and assist with some kind of transformation of the VA structure so that veterans 5 years from now or even 3 years from now will not have to wait a year or 2 years?
Great question. I think the short answer is absolutely. Because I think that the things that the VA are still wrestling with, quite honestly, this is pretty low-hanging fruit. And why we haven't made more progress on these issues, I think, says a whole lot about not just the kind of the culture, but the focus. I think the other challenge of the VA, and again, I'm in no way am I dismissing the commitment of people of the VA. We have a lot of great friends who all work for the VA, and they're good people, and they're working hard. I just think that the boulder is really big that they're having to push every day. And also the other challenge of the VA is how decentralized it is. So you can have the VA in Washington, D.C., but how much control does that VA in Washington, D.C. have over the VA over in Waco, or the VA in Des Moines, or the VA in Baltimore? And so I think better figuring out a way of coordinating the VAs around the country, better figuring out ways of actually coordinating the activities of even of the smaller branch-out organizations that the VA then has responsibility for, I think becomes crucial. And quite honestly, I think there are a lot of private sector lessons that can not only be taught, but that can also come up with some very strong partnerships to do a better job of helping to facilitate that process. Because the VA in Washington, D.C., they are, they're the main central organization behind it. But where we're really starting to see a lot of the cracks and where we're seeing things like the paper trails and all this kind of stuff is when you really break it down to these local VAs who feel completely overwhelmed because they are just not prepared for the type of numbers that they're talking about.
All right. With that, we'll leave it. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Wes Moore.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Roosevelt House, the Aspen Institute, Lori Tish, Linda, thank you. And I would just leave you with whatever platform you have, a lot of you have them in New York City, think about how you could use it, at least some part of it, to help this problem, because it is a big problem and it requires private help. I put myself at the top of that list. There's a lot of talk in the news about war fatigue. Audiences don't want to hear about the wars anymore. That's not good enough. You have to talk about it. And when the war is over next year, quote, over, there are going to be more wars to be fought with our veterans. We have to keep this top of mind, and it requires all of us staying on top of it. So I encourage you to do that as you leave tonight. And thank you so much. And Wes, thank you again.